The silver urn resting on the marble mantelpiece was supposed to hold the ashes of my only son. Brad was 45 years old when the police pulled his charred truck from the bottom of a deep mountain ravine just 3 days ago. Now his beautiful home was filled with the quiet murmurs of people wearing black, eating catered sandwiches, and offering me empty apologies. But my eyes were not on the guests. My eyes were fixed on the kitchen island, where my daughter-in-law Natalie stood holding a glass of expensive red wine. She was supposed to be a grieving widow. Yet as she leaned against the marble counter, she looked entirely too relaxed. Her makeup was flawless. There were no dark circles under her eyes, no redness from crying. Standing right beside her was Trent, my son, and his business partner. Trent leaned in close to her, whispering something in her ear. Natalie let out a soft, breathy laugh, before quickly catching herself and replacing it with a somber frown as a guest walked past. My stomach twisted into a hard knot. I am 75 years old. My name is Richard. You do not live 3/4 of a century without learning how to read people. That was not the laugh of a woman who just buried her husband. That was the laugh of a woman who had just won the lottery. Before I could walk over there and demand to know what was so funny, my cell phone vibrated in the breast pocket of my suit. I pulled it out. The caller ID showed a local Seattle number I did not recognize. I stepped away from the crowd, moving into the quiet hallway near the coat closet, and pressed the phone to my ear. I said a gruff hello. The voice on the other end was young, sounding bored and tired. The man asked if he was speaking to Richard. I told him he was. The man said he was calling from the Lost and Found Baggage Department at the SeaTac International Airport. He told me that they were clearing out the short-term rental lockers in Terminal B, and they found a heavy canvas duffel bag. I frowned, asking what that had to do with me. The employee sighed, typing something on a keyboard. He said the locker was registered under the name Brad, but the emergency contact tag on the bag had my name and my phone number on it. My heart stopped beating for a second. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. I asked him when the bag was left there. The employee told me the locker was rented and sealed at exactly 2 a.m. on Thursday. The hallway started to spin. I leaned my shoulder against the wall to keep my balance. The police report stated clearly that my son died in a fiery car crash on the mountain pass at 10 at night on Wednesday. The timeline was completely impossible. A dead man cannot check a bag into an airport locker 4 hours after his body burned in a ravine. The police had told me the fire was so intense they had to use dental records to identify the remains. I had believed them. I had stood in the pouring rain earlier that day, watching them place that urn on a pedestal, feeling like my own life was over. I did not say another word to the airport employee. I hung up the phone, turned around, and walked straight out the front door into the freezing Washington rain. I did not look back at the people in the living room. I did not look at Natalie. I just walked down the driveway and climbed into my old Ford pickup truck. The engine roared to life, a familiar rumble that matched the storm brewing inside my chest. I threw the truck into gear and sped away from the house, heading straight for the highway. The rain lashed against the windshield as I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal. My calloused hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my joints ached. These hands were rough, covered in thick scars, and permanently stained with motor oil. For 40 years I worked down at the Seattle docks as a heavy crane mechanic. I spent my entire life breathing in salt rust and diesel fumes, breaking my back to put food on the table. I did all of that for Brad. I saved every penny I earned pulling double shifts in the freezing cold so my son could go to business school. I funded his first car dealership. I built his dream from the ground up with my own 2 hands. We spent countless weekends underneath the hoods of broken-down cars, laughing and talking about the future. Brad was not just my son. He was my best friend. And now they told me he was dead. But the phone call changed everything. The grief that had been suffocating me for the last 3 days was instantly replaced by a sharp, burning focus. If Brad checked that bag at 2 in the morning, he was running from something. And if he was running, maybe the ashes in that silver urn belonged to someone else. I merged onto the interstate highway, weaving through the heavy evening traffic. My mind raced back to the image of Natalie and Trent in the kitchen. Their relaxed posture, the hidden smiles, the expensive wine. It all felt wrong. My son was a meticulous man. He had obsessive-compulsive disorder when it came to his business and his family. He would never drive dangerously on a mountain pass in the middle of the night. He would never leave his 12-year-old son Leo behind without a reason. The glowing signs for the airport appeared through the rain. I took the exit, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I bypassed the main parking garage and pulled the truck into the short-term passenger loading zone, ignoring the angry shouts of a security guard. I left the engine running, slammed the door, and walked briskly into the terminal. The bright fluorescent lights of the airport blinded me for a moment. I pushed past travelers with their rolling suitcases, my heavy work boots thudding against the polished tile floor. I followed the signs for the automated rental lockers. My breath came in shallow gasps, not from physical exhaustion, but from the sheer anticipation of what I was about to find. I reached the bank of metal lockers tucked away near the restrooms. Locker number 402. There it was. A blinking red light on the electronic keypad indicated it was locked and past its rental time. I stood in front of the metal door. The keypad required a 4-digit passcode. I closed my eyes, trying to think like my son. What number would Brad use when he was panicked, running for his life, and leaving a bag for me to find? It had to be something only we would know, something he valued more than anything else in the world. I opened my eyes and reached out. I pressed the number 0814. August 14th. The birthday of his son, my grandson Leo. The machine beeped. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed from inside the metal box. The red light turned green. The locker door clicked open. I reached inside the dark metallic cavern of the locker. My rough fingers brushed against the heavy canvas. I grabbed the thick handles and pulled. It was a dark green duffel bag, tightly packed and much heavier than it looked. I hauled it out, letting the heavy metal door swing shut behind me. It locked with a hollow echo that bounced off the empty terminal walls. I did not waste time looking around to see if anyone was watching me. I hoisted the strap over my shoulder and walked swiftly back out into the freezing Washington rain, keeping my head down. The walk back to the passenger loading zone felt like a blur. My truck was exactly where I had left it, the engine still idling, a low and steady rumble, cutting through the sound of the heavy storm. I opened the passenger side door, threw the heavy bag onto the worn fabric seat, and climbed behind the steering wheel. I slammed the door shut, sealing myself inside the quiet cabin. The heater was blowing warm air, but I felt completely frozen down to my bones. I reached out and turned on the overhead dome light. A harsh yellow glow illuminated the cab. I looked down at the duffel bag resting on the passenger seat. The main zipper was tied tightly shut with a small thick piece of nylon paracord. I leaned in closer, my eyes narrowing at the way the cord was twisted, looped, and secured. It was a very specific, complicated slipknot. My breath hitched in my throat. Suddenly, I was not sitting in a cold truck outside an airport. I was sitting on a small aluminum fishing boat in the middle of Puget Sound 30 years ago. The morning air was thick with salt and fog. A teenage Brad was sitting across from me, his small hands clumsy, as he tried to secure the heavy anchor line. I had reached over, holding his hands in mine, and taught him this exact knot. I told him it was the only knot he could ever truly trust with his life when the water got rough. He never forgot it. And looking at it now, tied perfectly around the zipper of this bag, I knew the truth. This was not some cruel prank. This was not a setup. My son had tied this cord. My son was alive. My hands trembled as I carefully untied the paracord, preserving the loop. I pulled the heavy brass zipper open. The bag parted, revealing the contents hidden inside. I reached in and pulled out a small, dark blue booklet. A passport. I flipped it open. The photograph staring back at me was unmistakably Brad. He looked exhausted, his hair uncombed, his eyes wide and panicked. But the name printed next to his face was Thomas Weaver. It was a complete high-quality forgery. I set the fake passport on the dashboard and reached into the bag again. My fingers brushed against thick, smooth plastic. I pulled out a heavy rectangular brick. It was completely wrapped in vacuum-sealed plastic. Inside the tight wrapping were thick stacks of $100 bills. I reached back into the bag and pulled out another brick, then another, and another. There were 7 bricks in total. I did not need to count every single bill to know what I was looking at. It was at least $70,000 in pure, untraceable cash. As a man who had spent his entire life counting pennies, turning heavy wrenches, and breaking his back for an hourly wage, the sight of that much money made my blood run cold. Honest men do not carry forged passports. Honest men do not carry bags of sealed cash. And honest men do not disappear in the middle of the night. There was one last item resting at the bottom of the canvas bag. I reached down and picked it up. It was a cheap black plastic flip phone, the kind you buy with cash at a gas station and throw away after a single use. I held it in the palm of my hand. It felt incredibly light, but it carried the weight of my entire world. I pressed the power button on the side. The small screen lit up, casting a pale blue glow across my weathered face. The battery icon showed it was almost fully charged. I navigated through the simple menu using the plastic keypad. There were no saved contacts. There were no text messages. There was no call history. I opened the media gallery. There was exactly one file saved on the device. It was a video. I took a deep breath, the air trembling in my lungs, and pressed the play button. The video started with a shaky, chaotic blur before the camera finally focused. The background was unmistakable. It was the white-tiled wall and metal partition of an airport bathroom stall. Then Brad appeared on the screen. He was holding the phone close to his face. He was sweating heavily, his breathing ragged and uneven. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes darting toward the bathroom door before turning his gaze back to the camera. When he spoke, his voice was nothing more than a desperate, hurried whisper. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "If you are watching this, it means I made it to the locker. It means I am gone, but I am still breathing. I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not trust anyone. I am not in that urn. The police, the fire, the crash on the mountain, it was all a setup. Natalie and Trent cut the brakes on my truck. They wanted me dead." I sat frozen in the driver's seat, my heart slamming against my ribs. I could hear my own pulse roaring in my ears. Brad swallowed hard, a tear slipping down his pale cheek in the video. "They are washing cartel money through the dealership, Dad. Millions of dollars. I found out, and they realized I knew. They were going to kill me and take the life insurance. I had to fake my death to get out. I had to leave. But I could not take Leo. They are watching him too closely. Please, Dad, take the money. Take Leo and run. Run as far as you can." The video abruptly cut off, plunging the screen back into a static menu. I sat in the absolute silence of my truck, the rain pounding against the metal roof like a drum. The grief that had weighed me down for days vanished completely, burned away by a sudden, terrifying rage. My daughter-in-law was a murderer, my son was a hunted ghost, and my grandson was sleeping under the same roof with monsters. I closed the flip phone and gripped the steering wheel. The funeral was over. The war had just begun. I put the truck in drive and pulled away from the airport curb. The digital clock blinked 3:45. The roads were empty, slick with rain, and reflecting the streetlights. My mind was moving faster than the tires spinning on the wet asphalt. I had to get to Brad's house. I had to get my grandson. Every second Leo spent there was a second he breathed the same air as the monsters who tried to murder his father. I did not care about his clothes or toys. I just needed to grab him, throw him in the truck, and drive. Then we would use the $70,000 to disappear just like Brad asked. I turned into their neighborhood, but I did not pull into the driveway. I parked 2 blocks away under a massive oak tree and cut the engine. I stepped into the freezing storm, ignoring the chill seeping through my funeral suit. I walked briskly down the sidewalk, keeping my head down, my footsteps light on the pavement. Reaching Brad's property, I bypassed the front door. Instead, I walked around the manicured hedges to the side of the 3-car garage. I reached behind a loose brick near the concrete foundation and pulled out the spare brass key I had hidden there almost 3 years ago. The metal was freezing cold against the rough palm of my hand. I slipped the key into the deadbolt lock, turned it with agonizing slowness, and opened the heavy side door. The familiar smell of motor oil, damp cardboard boxes, and Brad's old pine woodworking projects immediately hit my nose. It smelled exactly like my son. I stepped inside the garage and silently pushed the door closed behind me until it safely latched. I moved through the pitch-black space with the practiced ease of a man who had spent countless weekend hours building wooden cabinets in this very room. I reached the solid oak door leading directly into the main house. It was unlocked. I turned the brass handle, easing the door open inch by inch to make absolutely sure the old metal hinges did not squeak. I stepped into the tiled mudroom and crept forward toward the main carpeted hallway. The massive house was suffocatingly quiet. My rescue plan was simple. I would walk straight up the stairs to Leo's room, wake him up gently, and carry him right out the back door into the dark night. But as I rounded the corner toward the grand staircase, I froze in my tracks. A soft sliver of yellow light spilled from the slightly cracked door of the master bedroom at the far end of the hall. My heavy leather boots stopped dead on the polished hardwood floor. I quickly pressed my back flat against the cold plaster wall and held my breath. The bedroom door swung open wider, casting a long shadow across the expensive rug. A tall man stepped out into the hallway. It was Trent. He was no longer wearing the dark, respectful suit he wore to the funeral reception just a few hours ago. He was wearing a casual blue dress shirt, and his fingers were hastily fumbling to fasten the white buttons. He looked incredibly relaxed, completely at ease, walking around the private sanctuary of my dead son's home. A second later, Natalie stepped out into the hallway right behind him. She was wearing a short black silk robe. She reached out with both hands, grabbed Trent by the collar of his half-buttoned shirt, and pulled him in for a deep, lingering kiss. A sudden, violent tickle formed deep in the back of my throat. I desperately needed to cough. The sheer adrenaline flooding my old veins was making my chest tight and my lungs burn. But I closed my eyes tightly and swallowed hard, forcefully, pushing the physical urge down. I vividly remembered my harsh days in the military, lying completely still in damp, muddy trenches, practicing tactical breathing control to remain invisible to enemy patrols. Breathe in slowly through the nose, exhale silently through the mouth. Control the body and you control the mind. If I coughed right now, if I stepped out of the shadows and wrapped my heavy mechanic's hands around Trent's neck, I would be playing right into their deadly trap. I currently held the ultimate element of surprise, and I could not waste it on a fleeting burst of blind anger. Watching them whisper sweet words to each other in the dim light, the brutal reality of the situation fully locked into place inside my brain. This was not a tragic accident. This was not a sudden, unpredictable crime of passion born from a momentary mistake. This was a cold, calculated, and perfectly coordinated criminal conspiracy. They had clearly been planning this cruel betrayal for months. They wanted the lucrative dealership, they wanted to launder the dangerous cartel money, and they needed Brad permanently out of the way to take it all. Suddenly, the quiet, sharp creak of a door hinge shattered the silence. Down the hall, the white door to the child's bedroom slowly opened. Little Leo slowly stepped out into the dim corridor. He was wearing his oversized pajamas, rubbing his sleepy eyes with his small, trembling fists. Trent panicked instantly. He shoved Natalie away and darted directly into the adjacent guest bathroom, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind him to hide in the dark. Natalie spun around to face her son. Her romantic, relaxed expression vanished in a split second, immediately replaced by a twisted mask of cold fury. She marched angrily toward the young boy and grabbed him tightly by his upper arm. Her sharp fingernails dug into his skin in a vicious way that made my blood boil hot enough to melt steel. I simply could not hide in the dark anymore. I took a deep breath, stepped out of the shadows, and pretended I had just arrived from the front door. The morning sun crept through the large kitchen windows, casting pale shadows across the expensive marble countertops. I stood by the coffee maker listening to the slow drip of the dark liquid. My hands gripped the edge of the counter. I had not slept a single minute. Instead, I spent the remaining hours of the night sitting in the dark guest bedroom, running every piece of the puzzle through my mind. When I stepped into the hallway last night, claiming I had just driven over because I could not bear to be alone, Natalie and Trent had bought the act completely. They thought I was a broken, confused old man seeking comfort. They had no idea I was a soldier gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. I poured myself a black coffee, letting my hands tremble just a little to maintain the illusion of frailty. I sat down heavily at the kitchen island, pulling my shoulders forward to make myself look smaller, defeated by grief. A few minutes later, I heard the soft padding of bare feet against the hardwood floor. Natalie walked into the kitchen. The silk robe from last night was gone, replaced by a conservative gray sweater and soft sweatpants. Her hair was tied back in a messy knot, and she strategically omitted her makeup to make her face look pale and exhausted. It was a masterful performance. If I had not seen her kissing Trent in the shadows a few hours ago, I might have actually felt sorry for her. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat on the stool across from me. She wrapped both her hands around the warm ceramic mug and stared down into the amber liquid. For a long moment, the only sound in the huge room was the hum of the refrigerator. Then the performance began. She let out a ragged, trembling breath. A single tear rolled down her cheek, catching the morning light, before splashing onto the marble counter. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with manufactured sorrow. She reached across the island and placed her manicured hand over my rough one. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking with fake emotion. "There is something I need to tell you. Something truly terrible. I did not want to burden you with this on the day of the funeral, but you have a right to know the truth about Brad." I looked at her, widening my eyes in feigned ignorance. I asked her what she was talking about. She squeezed my hand a little bit tighter. "Brad was not the man we thought he was," she said, letting out a quiet sob. "He had a secret, a horrible gambling addiction. It started a few years ago with offshore sports betting, and then it spiraled completely out of control. He was taking money from the dealership Dad, hundreds of thousands of dollars. He bankrupted the business. Worse than that, he borrowed money from very dangerous people. Loan sharks. They were threatening him. They were threatening us. That is why he was driving recklessly on the mountain pass that night. He was terrified. He was trying to run away from the debt." I sat perfectly still, listening to her spin this elaborate, toxic web. Outwardly, I nodded slowly, letting a look of devastated shock wash over my tired face. I even managed to squeeze out a few genuine tears, though they were tears of pure rage, not sorrow. Inwardly, however, my mind was working with cold, ruthless precision. I listened to her words the same way I used to listen to a heavy diesel engine. A good mechanic does not just hear the noise. He isolates. The knock identifies the friction and understands exactly which part of the machine is failing. Her story was structurally unsound. It was a catastrophic engine failure of a lie. Brad did not have a gambling problem. Brad had obsessive-compulsive disorder. It was a condition he battled his entire life. He was absolutely meticulous about numbers, order, and control. When he was a teenager, he used to organize his baseball cards by the serial numbers printed on the back. As an adult, he tracked every single penny he ever spent on a color-coded digital spreadsheet. He hated casinos. He hated the concept of luck. He despised risk because it was the one thing he could not calculate. The idea that my son would blindly throw hundreds of thousands of dollars at offshore sportsbooks was not just absurd, it was deeply insulting to his memory. But I did not say any of this. I let her think her engine was running smoothly. I lowered my heavy head, staring blankly at the dark coffee in my mug, and asked her in a shaking whisper what we were supposed to do now to fix this horrible situation. That was the exact cue she had been waiting for. She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater, her movements quick and rehearsed. She slid off the wooden stool, walked over to her leather tote bag, resting on the dining table, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She walked back to the kitchen island and gently pushed the envelope across the smooth marble surface until it stopped right in front of my coffee mug. She pulled out a sleek black pen and laid it carefully on top of the brown paper. "Trent and I have been up all night trying to fix this mess," she said, her voice dropping into an urgent, pleading tone. "We have spoken to the lawyers and the accountants. We can save the house and we can keep the dangerous people away from little Leo, but we have to act immediately before the creditors freeze everything. Sign these documents, Dad. It gives Trent and me the full legal power to sell the remaining dealership assets and quietly pay off the debts. Please, I am begging you. Just do it to protect little Leo." I stared down at the thick manila envelope and the sleek black pen resting on the marble counter. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I kept my face slack, letting my shoulders slump even further. I reached out with a trembling hand, my fingers brushing against the smooth paper. I squinted hard, bringing my face awkwardly close to the documents, and let out a long, frustrated sigh. I told Natalie that the text was just a blurry mess of gray ink. I reminded her about my cataracts, claiming that without my prescription reading glasses, which I had left back at my apartment, I could not even read the large print at the top of the page. I slowly pushed the pen away. I told her I would take the documents home, put on my glasses, read through them carefully, and bring them back signed by the afternoon. I promised her I wanted to do whatever was best to protect little Leo from these dangerous people. Natalie quickly tried to mask her deep, boiling frustration with a tight, overly sympathetic smile. She agreed, but her eyes were cold, calculating every second of delay. I tucked the heavy envelope under my arm, said a quiet goodbye, and walked out the front door. The drive back to my small apartment on the edge of town felt like navigating through a thick fog, even though the morning sun was now shining brightly. I pulled into my designated parking spot, turned off the engine, and sat in the quiet cab for a few moments, gathering my strength. My apartment was a modest one-bedroom unit on the ground floor. It was simple, clean, and filled with old photographs and quiet memories. I walked inside, locked the deadbolt behind me, and went straight to my small wooden workbench in the corner of the living room. I turned on the bright, articulated desk lamp, angling the harsh white light directly onto the wooden surface. I slid the thick stack of legal papers out of the envelope and spread them out. I did not just put on my reading glasses. I opened my toolbox, took out a heavy jeweler's magnifying glass, and sat down on the hard wooden stool. I started reading. I did not skip a single line or ignore a single comma. I read the main clauses, the subsections, and the microscopic fine print hidden at the very bottom of the pages. My mechanic's brain dissected the complex legal jargon piece by piece, stripping away the confusing terminology to reveal the bare mechanical truth of the contract. It took me nearly an hour to translate the lawyer speak into plain English. When I finally understood what the documents actually meant, a cold chill washed over my entire body. These papers had absolutely nothing to do with selling the car dealership to pay off offshore gambling debts. It was a complete, masterful fabrication. The primary document was a comprehensive legal waiver. If I signed my name on that dotted line, I would be voluntarily relinquishing my legal rights as the designated secondary guardian for my grandson, Leo. I would be handing over full uncontested custody to Natalie, stripping myself of any legal standing to ever see him or protect him again. But the second document was even worse. It was a formal, legally binding transfer of all primary beneficiary rights. Brad had a massive life insurance policy, one he had set up years ago, to ensure Leo would be taken care of no matter what happened. The policy was worth $5 million. In the event of his death, the money was supposed to go into a secure trust for the boy, with me acting as the sole financial executor. This document I was holding would completely dissolve that trust. It would reroute the entire $5 million payout directly into a private offshore bank account, solely controlled by Natalie and Trent. I sat back on my wooden stool, letting the heavy magnifying glass drop onto the workbench. They were not just trying to steal my son's money. They were trying to erase me completely so they could take the $5 million and disappear with my grandson. The pure, unadulterated evil of their plan was staggering. I stood up from the bench, my knees popping, and walked into my bedroom. I went to the small closet, got down on my hands and knees, and pulled out a heavy steel lockbox hidden under a pile of old winter coats. I entered the combination and popped the thick metal latches. Inside the box rested my old military gear from my days in the service. My heavy tactical survival knife with its scratched blade and my old leather compass. Next to it sat my life savings bound in neat stacks. I had saved this money for emergencies. Now it was going to fund a war. I reached in and took out my old canvas field jacket. As I slipped my arms into the familiar heavy fabric, a profound psychological shift happened inside my brain. I was no longer a grieving father mourning a tragic accident. I was a soldier standing on a battlefield, and the enemy was sleeping in my son's bed. I walked back into the living room, reached into my pocket, and pulled out the cheap black flip phone I had found inside Brad's duffel bag at the airport. I flipped it open. I navigated to the contacts list. There was only one single phone number saved in the small device's digital memory bank. I pressed the green call button and lifted the small plastic phone to my ear. It rang twice. Then a gruff, gravelly voice answered on the other end, accompanied by the faint sound of traffic in the background. "Vince's private investigations," the deep voice said. "You are the old man, right? Your son paid me $20,000 in cash to help you clean up this mess. So what is the play?" I gripped the phone tightly, the plastic creaking under the pressure of my fingers. I told Vince I would meet him the next day. I hung up the phone and began to pack. I did not take much. 2 weathered leather suitcases I had owned for over 30 years. I packed some heavy flannel shirts, a few pairs of denim jeans, my shaving kit, and the steel lockbox containing my military gear and the cash. I zipped the suitcases shut, carrying them out to my truck. The afternoon sun was warm, but the air inside my lungs felt like ice. I drove back to the massive house in the upscale neighborhood, parking my old Ford right in the center of the pristine circular driveway. I hauled the heavy suitcases up the front steps and rang the doorbell. Natalie opened the door. When she saw the luggage sitting by my boots, her forced smile faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine, unfiltered panic. I did not give her a chance to speak. I pushed past her, hauling the bags into the grand foyer. I dropped them onto the marble floor with a loud thud, letting my shoulders slump. I looked at her with wide, watery eyes, playing the role of the broken, terrified old man to perfection. I told her I could not bear to be alone in my quiet apartment anymore. I said the silence was driving me crazy, making me hear Brad's voice in the walls. I begged her to let me stay in the spare bedroom for a few weeks, just until the shock wore off. I reminded her in a voice loud enough for the curious neighbor checking her mail across the street to hear that we were the only family little Leo had left. Natalie's jaw tightened. I could see the gears turning behind her cold eyes. She wanted to throw me out. She wanted to scream and slam the door in my face. But she knew she could not. Not with the neighbors watching. Not when she needed me to sign away my custody rights and the $5 million life insurance policy. She forced a stiff, unnatural smile, telling me of course I could stay. She said family needed to stick together during such dark times. I thanked her profusely, picked up my bags, and walked straight upstairs to the guest room down the hall from Leo. The Trojan horse was now inside the gates. Later that evening, the house was suffocatingly quiet. Trent had left hours ago, and Natalie was downstairs in her office, supposedly dealing with the dealership's fabricated bankruptcy paperwork. I quietly stepped out of the guest room and walked down the carpeted hallway. I gently pushed open the door to Leo's bedroom. The room was dark except for a small blue nightlight shaped like a rocket ship. Leo was sitting cross-legged on his rug, surrounded by scattered pieces of a plastic construction truck. He was trying to snap a broken wheel back onto the axle, his small hands trembling with frustration. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes wide and fearful. I smiled softly, walking over and sitting down on the floor next to him. My joints popped a harsh reminder of my age, but I ignored the pain. I reached out and gently took the broken toy from his hands. I told him that some things just need a little patience and the right angle to be fixed. I showed him how the small plastic tab on the wheel needed to align perfectly with the groove on the metal axle. I guided his small fingers, helping him press it into place until we heard a satisfying click. Leo smiled, a tiny, fragile expression of joy that broke my heart. He reached out to spin the wheel, his pajama sleeve sliding up his arm. The breath caught in my throat. Wrapping around his thin wrist were 4 dark purple bruises perfectly shaped like the furious grip of an adult hand. The image of Natalie violently grabbing him in the hallway the night before flashed in my mind. The rage I felt earlier that day was nothing compared to the absolute blinding fury that consumed me in that moment. This was no longer just about stolen money or a faked death. This was violently personal. I pulled his sleeve back down, smoothing the fabric gently. I promised him in a voice steady as stone that no one was ever going to hurt him again. I stood up, kissed the top of his head, and quietly left the room. My mind was racing, plotting the next step of the war. I needed water. My mouth felt like it was full of dry sand. I walked down the hallway toward the master bathroom. As I approached the partially open door, I heard the sharp, distinct sound of a plastic pill bottle being shaken. I paused, my shadow falling across the doorframe. I peered through the crack. Natalie was standing over the toilet. She had a prescription bottle in one hand and a clear plastic bag in the other. I watched as she unscrewed the child-proof cap. She tipped the bottle over the toilet bowl, pouring a steady stream of small white pills into the water. She reached over and flushed, watching the swirling vortex pull the medication down the drain. Then she opened the clear plastic bag. It was filled with identical-looking white pills. She carefully funneled the replacement pills from the bag into the empty prescription bottle, screwed the cap back on, and placed it neatly inside the medicine cabinet. I did not move a muscle. I memorized the orange label on the bottle before she closed the cabinet door. It was Brad's anti-anxiety medication, the prescription he had taken daily for years to manage his obsessive-compulsive disorder. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. She had not just tampered with his truck. She had been systematically replacing his real medication with something else entirely. Perhaps a stimulant, perhaps sugar pills. She had been deliberately altering his brain chemistry, driving him to the edge of a mental breakdown, making him erratic and paranoid. She was building a medical history to support her lies about his sudden gambling addiction and reckless behavior before the crash. I backed away from the door, silently, my boots making no sound on the thick carpet. I retreated to the guest bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my hands curled into tight fists. They had planned his destruction down to the very last pill, but they made one fatal mistake. They forgot about the mechanic. The next morning arrived with a heavy blanket of gray clouds rolling over the Seattle skyline. I sat at the kitchen island, sipping my black coffee, playing the part of the grieving grandfather to absolute perfection. At exactly 9 o'clock, Natalie walked down the stairs wearing expensive black athletic leggings and a matching jacket. She told me in a soft and supposedly heartbroken voice that her therapist had recommended a specialized grief yoga class to help her process the trauma of losing Brad. She kissed Leo on the forehead, told me she would be back by noon, and walked out the front door. I watched through the sheer living room curtains as her sleek silver SUV backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the tree-lined street. As soon as she was completely out of sight, I dropped the act. The time for weeping was over. It was time to go to work. I walked over to the front door and unlocked the deadbolt. 10 minutes later, a beat-up white panel van with the words "Generic Plumbing Services" painted on the side pulled into the driveway. A large, broad-shouldered man stepped out. He was wearing stained blue coveralls, carrying a heavy red metal toolbox, and chewing on a burnt toothpick. This was Vince. He walked up the front steps with a heavy, deliberate stride. I opened the door before he could even knock. We did not exchange any pleasantries or shake hands. He simply nodded, stepped inside the foyer, and closed the door behind him. I led him straight upstairs to the guest bedroom, which was now serving as my tactical command center. Vince placed his heavy red toolbox on the mattress and popped the metal latches. It was not filled with wrenches or pipe sealant. It was packed with coils of thin-wire digital receivers and a collection of tiny, high-definition micro-cameras that were no larger than the head of a pushpin. Vince looked at me and asked if we had 3 hours. I told him we had exactly 2.5. We moved quickly and silently through the massive house. Vince took the living room and the master bedroom, while I took Trent's home office down the hall. I held the small battery-powered drill in my calloused hands. As I carefully positioned the tiny drill bit against the ornate wooden molding near the ceiling, my mind flashed back to the shipyards. For 4 decades, my entire livelihood depended on absolute, unforgiving precision. When you are suspended 50 feet in the air, aligning the massive steel gears of a heavy cargo crane, there is zero room for error. If a single gear tooth is off by even 1 millimeter, the entire mechanical system will bind lock up and crash down with catastrophic force, destroying everything underneath it. Planting these tiny hidden cameras required that exact same level of ruthless precision. If the angle was slightly wrong, we would miss the crucial evidence. If the drill hole was a fraction of an inch too wide, Natalie or Trent would easily spot it, and our entire operation would violently collapse. I controlled my breathing, steadied my rough hands, and pressed the trigger. The drill whirred softly. I slipped the tiny lens into the microscopic hole, running the hair-thin wire down behind the drywall and connecting it to a small transmitter hidden inside a decorative wall sconce. We repeated this delicate, nerve-wracking process in the grand living room, hiding a camera inside the housing of a smoke detector. Finally, we moved into the master bedroom, the place where I had caught them together. Vince expertly concealed the final camera inside the ventilation grate, positioned directly above the large bed. Every corner of their private world was now under my total surveillance. With the visual traps perfectly set, we retreated to the guest bedroom. Vince pulled a sleek black laptop from the bottom compartment of his toolbox and flipped it open. He connected an antenna to the side port and began typing furiously. He was not just checking the camera feeds. He was actively tapping into the house wireless network, routing a backdoor connection directly into the desktop computer sitting in Trent's home office. Green code rapidly scrolled across the dark screen as he bypassed the basic residential security firewall. He explained, without taking his eyes off the monitor, that Trent frequently worked from home, which meant his personal desktop had to be directly linked to the main financial servers at the car dealership. If we could access that specific network, we could find the exact digital paper trail of the cartel money they were laundering through Brad's business. I stood behind Vince, staring over his thick shoulder at the glowing screen, my heart pounding a slow and steady rhythm against my ribs. Suddenly, the scrolling code stopped. A prompt appeared in the center of the display, demanding an external verification sequence. Vince cursed under his breath, his fingers freezing over the keyboard. I asked him what was wrong. He leaned back in his chair and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He told me he had successfully breached the outer layer of the dealership network, but the core financial folders were heavily encrypted with military-grade security software. I asked him if he could hack through it. Vince shook his head, his expression grim. He explained that the system was air-gapped by a physical security measure. To unlock those specific folders and see the cartel ledgers, a digital password was useless. The system required a physical keycard to be swiped directly into the main terminal at the dealership. Without that small plastic card, the files would remain permanently locked, and we would never have the proof we needed to destroy them. I looked out the window, my jaw clenching tight. Trent had that specific keycard. I was going to have to carefully steal it right out of his own pocket. The next afternoon, I pulled my old Ford truck into the sprawling asphalt lot of the dealership. The sky was still a heavy, bruised gray, threatening rain. Beside me in the passenger seat sat little Leo. I had told him we were going to collect some of his father's personal belongings from the main office. It was a half-truth, but it was enough to get the boy out of that toxic house and serve as the perfect distraction. Before I turned off the engine, I looked over at my grandson. I asked him to keep Trent busy out on the main showroom floor for at least 10 minutes, asking about the engines and new models. Leo nodded earnestly. He missed his dad, and talking about cars was their special bond. He had no idea he was playing a crucial role in a heist. We stepped out of the truck, and the sharp, familiar scent of motor oil and heavy exhaust immediately hit my nose. For a normal person, it was just the smell of a garage. But for me, it was the smell of my entire life. Decades of grease permanently worked into my fingerprints. I looked up at the massive glass windows and the shining steel logo above the main entrance. Brad and I had built this place from nothing. I vividly remembered spending our weekends poring over blueprints on my small kitchen table, calculating the concrete load for the service bays, and fighting with city inspectors over zoning permits. It was supposed to be an honorable legacy for his family. Now looking at the luxury vehicles gleaming under the showroom lights, it made me sick to my stomach. This beautiful dream had been quietly twisted into a multi-million-dollar crime scene, a massive washing machine for blood money. We walked through the sliding doors into the main lobby. Trent was standing near the reception desk wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a fake smile that did not quite reach his cold eyes. When he saw us, he put on his morning face, walking over with his hands clasped in front of him. He greeted me with a solemn nod and patted Leo awkwardly on the shoulder. I told Trent we wanted to gather a few photographs and small items from Brad's desk to make Leo feel better. Trent's eyes flickered with annoyance, but he quickly masked it with a sympathetic sigh. He said that was a wonderful idea. I nudged Leo gently. The boy looked up at Trent and asked in a quiet voice if he could see the engine on the black sports car sitting in the center of the showroom floor. Trent hesitated, glancing nervously down the hallway toward the executive offices. But with the receptionists watching the grieving partner, he was trapped. He forced a smile, telling Leo he would be happy to show him the car. As Trent led my grandson toward the expensive vehicle, I walked down the carpeted hallway toward the administrative wing. I slipped past Brad's empty office and headed straight for the heavy oak door at the end of the corridor. Trent's private sanctuary. The door was locked with a heavy-duty electronic keypad. It was a formidable barrier for a regular person, but I had spent 40 years bypassing heavy machinery security overrides. I reached into my pocket, pulling out a small magnetized bypass tool Vince had given me that morning. I pressed it against the bottom seam of the keypad, disrupting the electrical current just enough to trip the magnetic lock. The oak door clicked open. I stepped inside and silently pulled it shut behind me. The office was immaculate, smelling strongly of expensive cologne and leather. I moved quickly, my eyes scanning the room with the methodical precision of a mechanic diagnosing a complex engine failure. The computer monitor was dark, the tower securely locked beneath a heavy mahogany desk. I did not bother checking the obvious places. Men like Trent, who steal millions from cartels, do not keep the keys to their survival in a top drawer. I dropped down to my hands and knees on the thick carpet. I ran my calloused fingers along the underside of the heavy wooden desk, feeling along the hidden seams where the wood met the metal frame. Nothing. I crawled toward the heavy leather chair, checking underneath the armrests. Nothing. The digital clock on the desk read 3 minutes. My time was running out. I moved toward the large wooden filing cabinet near the window. I did not try to open the locked drawers. Instead, I reached around to the very back of the cabinet, sliding my rough hand along the dusty gap between the wood and the wall. My fingers brushed against a small flat square of thick duct tape. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dug my fingernail under the edge of the tape and peeled it back. A stiff plastic card fell directly into my palm. I turned it over. It was a blank black magnetic stripe card, the exact physical key card Vince needed to unlock the cartel ledgers hidden in the dealership network. I quickly slipped the card into my front shirt pocket. Just as I stood up, the sharp sound of heavy leather shoes echoed in the hallway. They were moving fast. I heard Trent's irritated voice telling someone to hold on a second. He was coming back to his office. I looked at the heavy oak door. There was no time to walk out and pretend I was lost. The footsteps stopped right outside. I heard the electronic security keypad beep loudly as he hurriedly punched in the private access code. I spun around in a panic, grabbing the brass latch on the large ground floor window directly behind his desk. I threw the window open, hoisted my heavy frame over the sill, and tumbled out into the wet bushes, just as the heavy oak door swung open behind me. I hit the damp earth hard, the thick branches of the landscaping bushes scratching against my face and arms. I stayed perfectly still, my chest heaving against the wet soil, listening to the heavy oak door open directly above me inside the office. I heard Trent cursing under his breath, paper shuffling, and then the window sliding shut with a loud click. He had not seen me. I waited another painful minute before slowly crawling out from under the dense foliage. I brushed the dirt from my jacket, checked my front pocket to ensure the black keycard was still safely secured, and walked briskly around the perimeter of the building. By the time I walked back into the main showroom through the front doors, my breathing was steady, and my face was an unreadable mask. Leo was sitting in the driver's seat of the black sports car, his hands happily gripping the leather steering wheel. Trent was standing nearby, looking incredibly impatient. I walked up, apologized for taking so long, and told Trent I could not find the specific photographs I was looking for. He forced a tight smile, clearly relieved to see us leaving. We walked out to the truck, and I drove my grandson back to the house, the stolen keycard burning a hole in my pocket. Later that night, the neighborhood was completely swallowed by a heavy, suffocating darkness. I told Natalie I was going to bed early, complaining about a headache. Instead, I slipped out the back door, walked 2 blocks down the silent street, and climbed into the passenger seat of Vince's white plumbing van. The interior of the van was pitch black, except for the faint blue glow illuminating from his laptop screen. I reached into my pocket and handed him the black magnetic keycard. Vince took it, a slow whistle escaping his lips. He immediately inserted the card into a portable card reader connected to his computer and began running the decryption sequence. While the machine worked on unlocking the cartel ledgers, Vince flipped a small metal switch on the dashboard console. He told me the cameras we planted earlier that day were working perfectly, but the visual feeds were currently blocked because all the lights in the house were turned off. However, the audio receivers were incredibly sensitive and broadcasting live. He handed me a pair of heavy black headphones. I slipped them over my ears. At first, all I could hear was the soft, rhythmic hum of the central air conditioning unit inside the massive house. Then a sharp, distinct sound cut through the static. It was the clinking of heavy crystal glasses. I recognized the acoustics. They were standing in the master bedroom right beneath the ventilation grate where we had hidden the microphone. Natalie let out a soft, melodic laugh. It was not the fake, trembling whimper she used around me or the neighbors. It was a bright, genuine sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Trent spoke next, his voice thick and relaxed, probably pouring them another round of expensive bourbon. He told her they only had to endure my pathetic, depressing presence for a few more days before the insurance money cleared the final fraud checks. Natalie sighed happily, saying my acting like a clueless, grieving old fool was almost too painful to watch, but it made manipulating me incredibly easy. As I listened to them mock my grief, my right hand instinctively reached down into the deep pocket of my coat. My thick fingers wrapped tightly around the cold, heavy steel of a crescent wrench I had brought with me. I squeezed the metal handle with every ounce of strength left in my aging body. My knuckles turned stark white, the skin stretching so tight over the bone that a small, old scar tore open. A warm trickle of blood seeped down my fingers, staining the steel, but I did not feel the pain. My breathing became ragged. Every primal fatherly instinct screaming inside my brain demanded that I throw the van door open, march down the street, kick the front door off its hinges, and smash their smiling skulls into unrecognizable pieces. I wanted to end their miserable lives right then and there. But I forced myself to sit completely still in the dark van. I had to let them hang themselves with their own words. Through the headphones, Trent took a slow sip of his drink and let out a satisfied exhale. Natalie asked him if he was absolutely sure there were no loose ends left at the crash site. Trent chuckled a low and cruel sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He told her to stop worrying. He said the local medical examiner had already signed off and the autopsy report was officially cleared. Then Trent uttered the words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. He said they had successfully bought the fake dental records from a corrupt clinic downtown. The homeless guy they placed in the driver's seat burned perfectly in the fire, Trent whispered. He said there was absolutely nothing left to identify, and the police completely bought the story. My heart stopped beating. The air was violently sucked out of my lungs. They had not just plotted to kill my son, they had abducted an innocent, nameless man off the streets, strapped him into Brad's truck, and burned him alive to serve as a perfect decoy. It was not just a calculated financial fraud anymore. It was cold-blooded, premeditated murder. I slowly took the heavy headphones off my ears and handed them back to Vince. He stared at me, his face pale in the blue light of the computer screen. He asked me what I wanted to do next. I wiped the fresh blood from the heavy steel head of my wrench using the rough denim fabric of my jeans. My vision tunneled the world, narrowing down to a single violent objective. We do not just expose them to the authorities, I whispered, my voice colder than the winter rain. We absolutely destroy them. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the sprawling house was heavy and thick, like the suffocating air right before a violent thunderstorm. I sat at the expansive kitchen island, forcing myself to chew on a dry piece of toast. I had not slept. The horrifying revelation from the audio tape the night before was still ringing loudly in my ears. Natalie walked into the kitchen, her expensive slippers making no sound on the floor. Her eyes were narrowed, darting around the room, with the paranoid intensity of a predator sensing a shift in its territory. She stopped and stared intensely at the decorative wall sconce in the living room, where Vince and I had hidden the first micro camera. I kept my head down, my hands trembling, just enough to maintain my fragile disguise. I knew my window of invisibility was rapidly closing. Trent arrived 20 minutes later, completely skipping his usual morning commute to the car dealership. He poured himself a mug of black coffee and leaned against the marble counter, exchanging a silent, venomous look with Natalie. They were absolutely plotting a counterattack. At exactly 10 o'clock, a loud, aggressive knock echoed through the grand foyer. It was not the polite tap of a neighbor or a delivery driver. It was the heavy, authoritative pounding of law enforcement. Natalie walked over and swung the heavy mahogany door open. A large man in a dark blue police uniform stepped into the house. His brass name tag read, Officer Miller. He had a thick, muscular neck and a hard face that looked like it had been carved out of cheap, weathered stone. I recognized his type immediately. He was not a man who joined the force to serve and protect the innocent. He was a local mercenary, wearing a tin badge, undoubtedly sitting comfortably on Trent's illicit payroll. Trent immediately stepped forward, extending his hand in a warm greeting, acting like a deeply concerned citizen who had just called for help. Officer Miller hooked his thick thumbs into his heavy black utility belt and looked directly across the room at me. He cleared his throat and announced in a loud, booming voice that the police department had received multiple anonymous calls regarding a severe disturbance at this residence. He claimed the reports explicitly stated that an elderly man living in the home was acting out violently, exhibiting advanced signs of severe dementia, and posing an immediate physical threat to a minor. I slowly stood up from my wooden stool, my hands gripping the edge of the cold marble counter. I told the officer that his statement was a complete and utter fabrication. I swore I had never raised my voice to my grandson, let alone threatened him. Officer Miller stepped closer, his heavy black boots thudding against the hardwood floor. His right hand came to rest casually on the handle of his service weapon. He lowered his voice into a low, menacing growl. He told me he had the absolute legal authority to contact Child Protective Services right this very minute. He promised me he could have little Leo forcefully removed from the home and thrown into the foster care system pending a full, lengthy psychological evaluation of my mental fitness. Natalie stood right behind the corrupt officer, her arms crossed tight over her chest. A sickeningly triumphant smile played on her lips. They were using my innocent 12-year-old grandson as a psychological hostage to force me out of the house. The hot, blinding rage flared up in my chest again, threatening to consume my rational thoughts. My fists clenched so tightly, my fingernails bit into the calloused skin of my palms. I wanted to grab the heavy coffee mug and smash it across Trent's smug face. But then a cold, incredibly vivid memory washed over me. I was instantly transported back to the freezing Seattle docks in the winter of 1984, during the brutal labor union strikes. I remembered dealing with the corrupt, wealthy union bosses who deliberately tried to starve us out on the picket lines. I learned a vital, painful lesson back then. When the game is completely rigged, and your enemy holds every single card, you do not throw a blind punch. You drop to your knees. You let the greedy bastards believe they have completely crushed your spirit. Unchecked arrogance is a massive tactical vulnerability. I let the righteous anger completely drain from my weathered face, intentionally replacing it with an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. I started breathing rapidly, taking shallow, desperate gasps of air as if my lungs were failing. I stumbled backward, making my legs give out in a perfectly executed collapse. My heavy shoulder slammed hard into a tall, wooden decorative table near the hallway. A heavy ceramic vase tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces. I fell to my knees among the broken pottery, clutching the center of my chest with both hands. I began crying out for Brad in a confused, broken, and pathetic voice. I played the role of a devastated old man whose fragile mind had finally snapped under the unbearable weight of grief and police intimidation. Trent chuckled softly, entirely unable to hide his cruel, sadistic amusement at my pathetic display. He stepped forward, playing the role of the benevolent, protective guardian for the officer's benefit. He grabbed me roughly by the shoulders to haul me to my feet. He pulled me hard against his chest, smirking over my shoulder, directly at the corrupt cop. He told me to calm down and go take my medication. But as Trent held me close, my calloused fingers moved with the invisible, practiced speed of a mechanic who had spent decades catching dropped bolts in blind engine compartments. I slipped my hand directly into the deep side pocket of his tailored suit jacket. In one smooth, flawless motion, I extracted the heavy, intricately cut metal key to his personal home wall safe. I palmed the cold brass perfectly inside my fist just a second before he pushed me away in disgust. They thought they had broken me completely unaware that I now held the key to their destruction. The clock on my bedside table glowed a harsh red, displaying exactly midnight. The sprawling house was finally dead silent. Trent had not gone home. I knew he was upstairs in the master bedroom with Natalie, celebrating what they believed was a flawless psychological victory over a broken old man. I slipped out of my bed, fully dressed in my dark clothes. I moved like a ghost down the carpeted hallway, out the back door, and into the freezing, damp Seattle night. I did not take my old Ford truck. The engine was too loud. Instead, I walked 3 blocks to where Vince had parked a dark, nondescript sedan for me earlier that evening. I slid into the driver's seat, started the quiet engine, and headed across town toward Trent's personal residence. Trent lived in a sleek, ultra-modern glass and steel townhouse in an exclusive gated neighborhood overlooking Lake Washington. It was a monument to unearned wealth and overwhelming arrogance. I parked the sedan a street over, hidden beneath the deep shadow of a weeping willow tree. I pulled my dark canvas collar up against the biting wind and walked purposefully toward his property. There were no lights on inside. I bypassed the main walkway, moving silently through the manicured side garden until I reached the heavy glass back door. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key I had stolen from his suit jacket just 14 hours ago. My hands were perfectly steady. I slid the metal into the lock. It turned with a smooth, satisfying click. I pushed the door open and stepped into the pitch-black kitchen. The air inside smelled sterile, like expensive cleaning chemicals and cold leather. I did not dare turn on a flashlight. I let my eyes adjust to the darkness, guided only by the faint moonlight spilling through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I navigated past the sharp edges of the modern furniture, heading straight for his home office. Trent was a creature of predictable, arrogant habit. He would not hide his most dangerous secrets in a basement or an attic. He would want them close, surrounded by his own luxury. I entered the office and moved my hands along the smooth, dark wood-paneled wall behind his massive desk. About 3 feet off the ground, my fingers brushed against a barely perceptible seam in the paneling. I pressed firmly against the edge. A section of the wood popped open, revealing a flush, heavy steel wall safe. There was no digital keypad. It was an old-school, high-security mechanical lock that required a specialized physical key, the exact key resting in my palm. I inserted the brass key into the cold steel slot and turned it firmly to the right. The heavy locking bolts retracted with a deep, heavy thud. I pulled the heavy door open. Inside, resting on the top shelf, was a thick black leather-bound ledger. I reached in and pulled it out. I set it carefully on the smooth surface of Trent's desk and pulled out Brad's burner phone. I flipped it open, navigating to the camera function. The dim screen provided just enough pale blue light for me to see the pages. I opened the heavy black cover. What I saw inside made the blood freeze solid in my veins. This was not just a record of stolen dealership funds. It was a highly detailed, incredibly organized accounting of a massive international money laundering operation. Page after page listed exact dates, wire transfer routing numbers, and offshore bank accounts located in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. But the numbers told an even darker story. I traced my calloused finger down the right side column. Trent and Natalie were not just washing money for a brutal Mexican cartel. They were actively stealing from them. I found a separate highlighted column detailing a skimming operation. Over the past 2 years, Trent and Natalie had quietly siphoned off exactly $5 million of the cartel's cash, funneling it into their own private accounts. That was the money they were planning to take to Europe. I held the phone steady, snapping a clear photograph of every single page. The faint click of the digital shutter echoed in the quiet room. As I reached the final section of the thick ledger, I found a loose piece of white paper folded in half. I opened it. It was a printed email from Trent to my son, dated 6 months ago. The words punched the air right out of my lungs. Trent explicitly detailed the skimming operation to Brad, stating that Brad was now legally implicated as the sole owner of the dealership. The final sentence of the email was a blunt, horrifying threat. Trent wrote that if Brad ever went to the police or tried to stop the money transfers, Trent would personally ensure that little Leo suffered a fatal, tragic accident. My vision blurred with a hot, stinging surge of tears. I had thought my son was a coward for running away, but looking at this printed threat, I finally understood the agonizing choice he had to make. Brad did not abandon his boy. He faked his own death to remove the target from Leo's back. He sacrificed his entire life, his name, and his freedom to protect his son from these absolute monsters. The guilt I felt for ever doubting him was quickly consumed by a raging, righteous fury. I neatly folded the printed email, placed it back between the pages, and closed the heavy leather cover of the ledger. I had all the proof I needed to burn their entire world down to ashes. I picked up the ledger and carefully placed it back onto the top shelf of the steel wall safe. I gripped the heavy metal door and pushed it shut. The locking mechanism engaged with a solid, echoing clank, but the moment the metal bolt slid back into place, a tiny, previously invisible red LED light, mounted flush into the wall paneling, violently flashed to life. A high-pitched electronic chirp sounded from a hidden speaker near the ceiling. It was not a blaring siren meant to scare away a common burglar. It was a silent, direct-line security tripwire. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped animal. I knew exactly what that small red light meant. Trent had wired the physical locking mechanism to a secondary, silent alarm. I had precisely 2 minutes to get out of the house and vanish into the darkness before heavily armed private security contractors swarmed the entire property. The alarm is triggered. 2 minutes. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury for the unprepared. I shoved the burner phone deep into my jacket pocket, turned on my heel, and moved swiftly through the dark modern house. I did not run. Running causes you to lose your balance and make careless mistakes. I simply power-walked back the exact way I had come, in retracing my steps past the sharp edges of the living room furniture and out the heavy glass back door. I pulled the door shut behind me, not bothering to lock it, and stepped off the manicured lawn onto the damp asphalt of the quiet street. I kept my head down, pulling my collar high, and maintained a steady, purposeful stride toward the shadows of the weeping willow tree where my sedan was parked. As I reached for the door handle, the screech of heavy tires echoed from the main road. 2 sleek black security vehicles with flashing yellow light bars aggressively turned onto the street, accelerating toward Trent's townhouse. A moment later, the distant wail of a police siren joined the chorus. They were incredibly fast, but I was already a ghost. I slid into the driver's seat, kept the headlights off, and quietly idled away down a narrow side alley, just as the armed guards swarmed the front gate of the property. I drove for 10 miles without turning on the radio, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. My breathing slowly returned to a normal rhythm. I pulled into the empty parking lot of a closed-down diner on the outskirts of the city and finally put the car in park. The rain had started again, drumming a slow, steady rhythm against the roof. I sat in the darkness, staring out at the glowing streetlights, and thought about my next move. A normal citizen would take the photographs of the ledger straight to the local police or the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But I was not a normal citizen, and this was not a normal situation. I remembered the smug, carved stone face of Officer Miller standing in my son's living room earlier that morning. Trent owned the local police force. If I handed that ledger over to the authorities, it would inevitably cross the desk of someone on Trent's payroll. The evidence would mysteriously vanish from the evidence room. My grandson would be taken away by Child Protective Services, and I would likely suffer a fatal heart attack in the back of a squad car. The justice system was a broken machine, and I did not have the time or the tools to fix it. I needed a much faster, far more lethal mechanism to solve my problem. I reached into the deep pocket of my jacket and pulled out the cheap black flip phone. I also took out a small rectangular black plastic device that Vince had handed to me earlier that evening. It was a digital voice scrambler designed to attach directly over the microphone of any standard cellular phone. I clipped it onto the bottom of the flip phone. I opened the photo gallery and looked at the picture I had taken of the final page of the ledger. Next to the cartel's primary routing numbers, Trent had written down an emergency contact. It was a local Chicago area code labeled with a single initial, the letter M. This was the cartel lieutenant responsible for overseeing the Pacific Northwest money laundering operations. I stared at the 10 digits. I was a 75-year-old heavy machinery mechanic. I had spent my life fixing broken cranes, drinking cheap domestic beer, and paying my taxes. Now I was about to call one of the most ruthless criminal syndicates on the planet. I took a deep, steadying breath, manually typed the numbers into the keypad, and pressed the green call button. The line rang 3 times. Then a voice answered. It was a deep, smooth voice, completely devoid of any emotion or warmth. The man simply said, "Yes." I held the phone close to my mouth, letting the digital scrambler distort my voice into a low, metallic rasp. I did not introduce myself. I did not make small talk. I used the same cold, simple logic I would use to explain a catastrophic engine failure to a furious shipyard boss. I told him he did not need to know my name, but he desperately needed to know about his money in Seattle. The man on the other end of the line went completely silent. I could hear the faint sound of a television playing in the background, but his breathing was steady and calm. I told him his local operators, Trent and Natalie, were bleeding him dry. I recited the exact routing numbers for his primary offshore accounts, proving I had intimate knowledge of his secure financial network. Then I delivered the fatal blow. I told him they had been quietly skimming the deposits for over 2 years, stealing exactly $5 million of his organization's money. I explained that they had recently secured the final funds and were currently booking private plane tickets to flee to Zurich, Switzerland on Sunday morning. The cartel lieutenant did not yell. He did not curse. His silence was far more terrifying than any threat. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of a loaded gun. He told me that accusations were completely worthless without solid proof, and if I was wasting his time, he would find me and skin me alive. I did not flinch. I told him I was sending the proof right now. I hung up the phone. I opened the message application, attached the clearest photograph I had taken of Trent's secret skimming column, and sent it directly to the Chicago number. I sat in the cold car watching the digital clock on the dashboard slowly change. 1 minute passed, then 2 minutes. The silence in the vehicle was deafening. Just as I was about to start the engine, the small flip phone vibrated in the palm of my hand. The screen illuminated the dark cabin. It was a single text message from the lieutenant. It contained only 5 words. "We will handle them Sunday." The next 2 days passed in a suffocating blur of forced smiles and quiet tension. Friday morning arrived with a bright, mocking beam of sunlight piercing through the heavy gray clouds. I sat at the kitchen counter mechanically chewing a piece of toast when Natalie floated down the grand staircase. She was not walking. She was practically gliding. She wore a pristine white cashmere sweater and an expression of pure, unfiltered triumph. Trent followed closely behind her, scrolling rapidly on his sleek smartphone, with a predatory grin plastered across his face. Natalie poured herself a cup of coffee, turned to me, and let out a dramatic, theatrical sigh. She announced in a voice dripping with fake maternal concern that she and Trent had made a sudden decision. They were going to take little Leo on an extended healing trip to Zurich, Switzerland. She claimed the boy desperately needed a change of scenery to process the tragic loss of his father. They were scheduled to leave in exactly 48 hours on Sunday morning. My stomach churned, but I kept my face perfectly blank. I knew exactly why they were suddenly in such a frantic rush to cross international borders. Through the hidden audio bugs Vince and I had planted, I had heard Trent celebrating late last night. The massive $5 million life insurance check had finally cleared the fraud department and landed securely in their offshore accounts. The final piece of their twisted puzzle was in place. They had the money, they had the forged documents, and now they were making their final run. I slowly nodded, telling her that a vacation sounded like a wonderful idea for the boy. I offered to go upstairs and help him pack his suitcases. Natalie waved her hand dismissively, telling me to go right ahead. She was far too busy counting her stolen millions to care about what a supposedly senile old man was doing. I walked back upstairs, my boots sinking into the plush fabric. I knocked gently on Leo's door and pushed it open. My grandson was sitting on the edge of his bed, looking completely miserable. An open suitcase lay on the floor, half filled with randomly tossed shirts and pants. He did not want to go to Europe with his mother and Trent. He wanted his father. I walked over, sat down next to him on the mattress, and put a heavy, comforting arm around his small shoulders. I told him we needed to pack efficiently, folding his clothes the way they taught me in the military to save space. As we worked quietly together, I reached into the deep pocket of my flannel shirt. I pulled out a heavy matte black steel watch attached to a worn olive green canvas strap. It was my old military-issue field watch. I had worn it during my service, and I had worn it every single day working at the Seattle shipyards. The glass face was heavily scratched, but the internal mechanical gears were completely indestructible. I took Leo's wrist and carefully strapped the heavy timepiece onto his arm. I pulled the canvas strap tight and buckled it. I looked deeply into his eyes, dropping the frail grandfather act completely. My voice was low, steady, and incredibly serious. I told him this was a very special watch, and it came with a very important mission. I showed him the small digital alarm dial on the side. I told him I had set the alarm for exactly 7 o'clock on Sunday morning. I leaned in close, ensuring my voice barely rose above a whisper. When this alarm beeps on Sunday morning, I said, I want you to drop whatever you are holding. Do not say goodbye to your mother. Do not say a word to Trent. You run straight out the back door, you get into my truck, and you do not look back. Leo looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and sudden desperate hope. He opened his mouth to ask a question, but before a single sound could escape his lips, the heavy wooden bedroom door swung violently open. Trent stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. His predatory grin was completely gone, replaced by a dark, furious scowl. He had taken off his suit jacket, and the muscles in his arms were pulled tight. He stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind him, with a sinister click. He walked slowly toward the bed, his dark eyes locked entirely on me. He asked in a low, threatening hiss what exactly I was whispering about to his new son. I stood up slowly, putting myself directly between Trent and my grandson. I kept my voice calm, telling him I was simply giving Leo an old family heirloom to remember his father by. Trent did not believe a single word. He closed the remaining distance between us in 2 quick strides. He reached out with both hands, grabbed the thick fabric of my flannel shirt, and shoved me backward with a sudden, violent burst of physical force. My heavy shoulders slammed hard against the bedroom wall, rattling the framed pictures hanging nearby me. Trent leaned in his face mere inches from mine, his breath smelling of stale coffee and arrogant hostility. He told me he was sick of my pathetic lurking. He warned me that if I tried to interfere with their trip, or if I put any crazy ideas into the boy's head, he would personally ensure I spent the rest of my miserable, shortened life locked away in a padded room, eating through a plastic straw. He tightened his grip on my shirt, waiting for me to tremble, waiting for me to beg for mercy. But I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. Instead, I let a slow, freezing smile spread across my weathered face. It was the cold, terrifying smile of a man who knew a deadly trap had already been set. Trent stared at my freezing smile, completely unnerved by my lack of fear. He scoffed, muttered an insult, and released his tight grip on my flannel shirt. He backed away, pointed a warning finger, and stormed out of the bedroom, slamming the heavy door behind him. I did not move a single muscle for a long moment. I listened to his heavy footsteps retreating down the hallway. Then I turned back to my grandson. Leo was trembling, staring at the closed door with wide, terrified eyes. I gently patted the military watch strapped to his wrist, giving him a reassuring nod. The countdown had officially begun. Friday and Saturday passed in a suffocating blur. Trent and Natalie moved around the house like frantic ghosts, hurriedly packing expensive designer luggage and making hushed, urgent phone calls to their overseas financial contacts. They ignored me, treating me like broken furniture about to be left behind. That was perfectly fine with me right now. Their blinding arrogance was the exact blind spot I needed to finalize my preparations. Late Saturday night, after the massive house finally fell dark and silent, I slipped out the back door and walked through the biting wind to Vince's white plumbing van, parked discreetly 3 streets over. I climbed into the passenger seat. The interior was illuminated only by the harsh pale glow of his laptop screen. Vince did not look up. His thick fingers were flying across the keyboard with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. He told me the trap was fully primed and ready to be sprung. He had spent the last 4 hours tracking a private jet that had just departed from a small, unregulated airstrip just outside of Chicago. The flight plan was registered under a dummy corporation, but Vince had traced the tail number back to the cartel lieutenant I had spoken to on the burner phone. The plane was scheduled to land at a private airfield in Seattle at exactly 5 in the morning. They were coming heavily armed and expecting to intercept a massive theft. But Vince had added a brilliant catastrophic variable to the equation. He explained that he had just forwarded the encrypted flight tracking data, along with a completely anonymous tip about a massive cartel cash movement to a trusted contact inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This contact was a clean, untouchable senior agent who owed Vince a major favor from a past case. The feds were mobilizing a tactical strike team right now. By 7 o'clock on Sunday morning, Trent and Natalie's driveway was going to turn into a violent high-stakes collision between a furious Mexican cartel and a heavily armed federal tactical unit. I thanked Vince for his incredible work, handed him a thick envelope containing the remaining cash from my life savings, and walked back to the sprawling house. I crept upstairs to the guest bedroom and locked the door behind me. I opened my weathered leather suitcase and reached beneath the stacks of folded flannel shirts. My rough fingers wrapped around the cold, heavy steel barrel of my old pump-action shotgun. I pulled the weapon out and laid it carefully across the mattress. It was a beautiful, incredibly rugged piece of machinery. I had owned this gun for over 40 years, using it for nothing more than occasional hunting trips in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest. I walked over to my bag, pulled out a small tin of gun oil and a soft cloth, and sat down on the edge of the bed. I began methodically cleaning the weapon. As I rubbed the oil into the dark, polished wood of the stock, the familiar sharp smell of the solvent filled the small room. I checked the sliding action, listening to the satisfying heavy mechanical clack of the steel chamber opening and closing. I was not cleaning this weapon because I intended to shoot anyone. I had survived a war and I knew exactly what a bullet did to the human body. I had no desire to have the blood of these miserable parasites on my hands. But I also knew exactly how violent men like Trent operated when they were cornered. When the cartel arrived, and when the federal agents breached the perimeter, there would be absolute, deafening chaos. I needed an anchor. I needed a heavy, terrifying tool of absolute psychological control to hold the room and ensure they did not try to use my grandson as a human shield. This shotgun was not an instrument of murder. It was a heavy steel wall between little Leo and the monsters trying to steal his future. I finished cleaning the weapon, loaded 3 heavy shells into the tubular magazine, and laid the shotgun carefully under the bed frame. I checked the small clock on the bedside table. It was 2 in the morning. 5 hours until the alarm on Leo's watch would beep. 5 hours until the world collapsed. There was one final task left to complete. I slipped a small pair of wire cutters from my pocket, stepped out of the guest room, and moved silently down the stairs to the basement door. I navigated the pitch-black concrete stairs, relying entirely on my memory of the house layout. I found the main utility panel mounted on the cold, damp cinder-block wall. I opened the metal box and located the thick black cables feeding the digital router and the primary landline system. I gripped the rubber handles of the wire cutters, placed the sharp steel blades around the thick bundle of communication wires, and squeezed with all my remaining strength. The wires severed with a dull snap. The faint glowing green lights on the modem instantly went dark. I closed the utility box and walked back upstairs. The trap was locked. I had completely cut the internet and phone lines. When the wolves arrived at the door tomorrow morning, Absolutely no one in this house was calling for help. I sat in the dark guest bedroom listening to the rain transition into a cold drizzle. I did not sleep. I sat on the edge of the mattress with my shotgun resting on my knees. I watched the clock on the bedside table as the red numbers ticked forward. 5 o'clock. 6 o'clock. The house began to wake up. I heard the sounds of frantic movement coming from the master bedroom. Drawers slamming shut, closet doors opening, and the clicking of high heels on the hardwood floor. Trent and Natalie were getting ready for their grand escape. They believed they had committed the perfect crime. They believed they had murdered my son, framed an innocent homeless man, and stolen $5 million without leaving a trace of evidence. At exactly 6:45, I heard the rhythmic thud of their expensive designer luggage being dragged down the grand wooden staircase. I stood up from the bed. My joints popped and ached, protesting the damp cold, but my mind was incredibly sharp. I walked over to the bedroom door, cracked it open, and peered into the corridor. Trent was wearing a tailored black overcoat, looking like a wealthy executive heading off on vacation. Natalie was wrapped in a thick wool trench coat, holding 2 leather boarding passes in her manicured hand. They left their bags by the front door and walked toward the kitchen to grab a coffee before the private car arrived. I slipped out of the bedroom and moved silently down the back stairs, gripping the shotgun tightly in my right hand. I positioned myself in the dark shadow of the dining room archway, completely hidden from their view, but with a clear line of sight to the main foyer. The microwave display read exactly 6:59. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm. I listened to Natalie complaining about the rainy weather in Zurich, her voice completely devoid of any guilt. Then the electronic beeping sound pierced the quiet morning air. It was a rapid alarm coming from the hallway near the kitchen island. Leo was standing there wearing his winter coat and holding a small backpack. He looked down at the scratched face of the military watch I had strapped to his wrist. The alarm was ringing loudly. Leo looked up. His young eyes darted toward his mother, then toward the back door. He remembered my exact instructions. He did not speak. He dropped his backpack onto the tiled floor, turned and sprinted straight down the hallway toward the wooden door. I heard the deadbolt click open and the door slam shut. He was gone, running safely toward the hidden cab of my truck, parked in the alleyway. Trent spilled his coffee on the marble counter. He yelled Leo's name, his voice echoing loudly through the kitchen. He wiped his hand on a towel and stomped toward the back hallway, furious that the boy had disobeyed him. He muttered something about teaching the brat some respect before they boarded the plane. Natalie followed closely behind him, her face twisted into an ugly scowl. They marched back toward the foyer to grab the luggage and go after the boy. They did not make it to the front door. I stepped out of the dark archway and planted my work boots firmly on the polished hardwood floor. I stood directly between them and the front door, blocking their only exit. I did not slouch. I did not tremble. Decades of working on the Seattle docks, holding heavy steel beams, while the wind howled off the freezing water, had forged my spine out of iron. I stood there like a massive, immovable pillar of pure vengeance. I raised the barrel of the shotgun and grabbed the wooden pump handle with my left hand. I pulled it back and slammed it forward. The heavy steel mechanism racked with a deafening metallic clack that echoed like a thunderclap inside the pristine house. A bright red shotgun shell slid perfectly into the firing chamber. Trent froze instantly, his polished leather shoes skidding slightly on the slick floor. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly gray. He threw his hands up in the air, his eyes locked onto the dark muzzle of the weapon pointed directly at his chest. Natalie let out a piercing scream. She stumbled backward, dropping her leather boarding passes onto the floor. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her voice shrill and unhinged. She called me a crazy old fool, a demented lunatic who had lost his mind. She screamed that she was calling the police right now, that I was going to be locked in a federal prison for threatening them with a deadly weapon. She frantically reached into her designer purse and pulled out her smartphone, jabbing at the touchscreen to dial for help. She did not realize the wireless router was completely dead. I simply stared at them with cold, dead eyes. I reached into the deep inside pocket of my flannel coat with my free hand. I pulled out a thick manila envelope and tossed it carelessly across the room. It landed squarely on top of their pristine leather luggage. The metal clasp popped open and a stack of documents spilled out onto the floor. There were verbatim audio transcripts detailing their vile conversations, sharp color photographs of Trent's secret cartel ledgers, and a copy of the authentic dental records belonging to the nameless man who burned to death on the mountain pass. Natalie stared down at the scattered papers, her mouth falling open in silent horror as her brain processed what she was looking at. I leveled the shotgun directly at them, the cold steel steady in my grip. "I know about the cut brakes on the truck," I said, my voice echoing like cold iron. "I know about the homeless man you burned alive. And I know about the $5 million you stole from the cartel." For a long, agonizing moment, the grand foyer was completely silent, save for the sound of Natalie's panicked, ragged breathing. Trent stared at the scattered documents resting on top of his expensive leather suitcases. The color had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a sickly pale sheen of cold sweat. His eyes darted from the printed audio transcripts to the undeniable proof of the stolen cartel ledgers, and finally up to the dark, unblinking muzzle of my shotgun. The meticulously crafted mask of the grieving business partner and the caring stepfather instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. The sophisticated executive disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a desperate, cornered rat. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He slowly reached his right hand inside the breast pocket of his tailored black overcoat. I did not flinch. I did not adjust my aim. I simply tightened my finger against the cold steel of the trigger, waiting for him to make his final mistake. Trent pulled out a small, sleek black pistol. He raised it, pointing the barrel directly at my chest. But he was not a soldier. He was a coward who hired other people to do his dirty work. His hand was shaking so violently that the front sight of the pistol vibrated in the air. His eyes were wide with pure, unfiltered terror. He looked at my face, searching for a trace of hesitation, a hint of fear, or a sign that the old man standing before him was bluffing. He found absolutely nothing. I stood there like a stone monument, my breathing slow and perfectly controlled. I had spent my entire life working around massive, swinging steel beams and high-voltage machinery, where a single moment of panic meant instant death. A shaking coward with a small handgun did not frighten me in the slightest. Trent licked his dry lips, his voice trembling as he finally broke the heavy silence. He told me to put the shotgun down. He tried to inject authority into his tone, but it cracked pathetically. He insisted that we did not need to do this, that nobody else had to get hurt. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes desperately pleading with me to be reasonable. He told me that I had won, acknowledging that I had uncovered their entire operation. He forced a hollow, sickeningly sweet smile, attempting to appeal to my sense of greed. He said there was more than enough money to go around. He promised that if I just lowered the weapon and let them walk out that front door, he would personally wire $1 million into any bank account of my choosing. He swore on his life that I would never have to work another day, that I could retire in absolute luxury and never hear from them again. A low rumbling sound began deep within my chest. It grew louder, rising up through my throat until it escaped my lips as a harsh, bitter laugh. The sound echoed through the sterile house, devoid of any humor or warmth. I laughed at his sheer ignorance. I laughed at the pathetic reality that this miserable creature genuinely believed he could buy a father's love with stolen cartel cash. My laughter abruptly stopped, replaced by a stare so cold it seemed to drop the temperature in the room. I kept the shotgun leveled precisely at his chest. I told him he did not understand a single thing about how the real world worked. I explained that men like him and Natalie were nothing but parasitic worms feeding off the hard work, the trust, and the love of honorable people. They spent their entire lives chasing paper money, buying expensive cars, and living in glass houses completely empty inside. I told him that true wealth was not measured by offshore bank accounts or stolen millions. True wealth was the calloused skin on a father's hands after working a double shift to pay for his son's education. True wealth was the unshakable bond of blood, the absolute willingness to stand between your family and the fire, and the silent promise to protect your legacy at any cost. I told him that he could offer me every single dollar in the world, and I would still gladly pull this trigger to ensure he never cast a shadow on my grandson again. Trent's hand shook harder, the pistol wavering wildly. He realized then that I could not be bought, reasoned with, or intimidated. He was looking into the eyes of a man who had already accepted his own death to save his family. Behind him, Natalie was frantically tapping the screen of her smartphone. Her manicured fingers were moving in a frantic blur, desperately trying to dial the emergency dispatch number. She held the phone to her ear, her face contorting in sheer panic. She pulled the device away, staring at the screen in disbelief. She whimpered, complaining that she had absolutely no signal. She looked up at Trent, tears of genuine terror streaming down her perfectly contoured face. She told him the calls were not going through, that the entire network was completely dead. I watched the realization wash over them. The severed cables in the basement. The locked doors. They were completely trapped inside their own luxurious fortress, isolated from the outside world they thought they controlled. Then the silence of the rainy Sunday morning was violently broken. It was not the sound of police sirens or the gentle hum of an airport taxi. It was a heavy, aggressive noise. The unmistakable sound of thick, oversized tires violently crunching over the loose gravel of the long private driveway. Multiple heavy vehicles were rapidly approaching the house, bringing a storm of absolute destruction directly to their doorstep. The engines roared louder with every passing second, shaking the glass windows. They had run out of time, and there was nowhere left for them to hide. The violent crunching of gravel outside grew loud, echoing through the high ceilings of the grand foyer like the rolling thunder. Trent slowly backed away from the large glass windows framing the mahogany front door, his trembling hand dropping the pistol onto the hardwood floor. It landed with a thud, sliding toward my work boots. I did not bother to pick it up. I kept my shotgun leveled firmly at his chest, though I knew the real threat was no longer inside this house. I took a single step sideways, positioning myself where I could see through the sheer curtains without exposing my body to the exterior. 3 matte black vehicles had violently breached the perimeter. They swerved aggressively across the manicured lawn, their heavy tires tearing muddy trenches into the grass, before slamming to a halt right in front of the marble steps. The heavy doors of the vehicles swung open in terrifying unison. 6 men stepped out into the freezing morning rain. They wore tactical clothing, and their faces were carved from the same cold stone as the cartel lieutenant I had spoken to on the burner phone. They moved with a predatory efficiency, carrying heavy automatic rifles from slings across their chests. They were highly trained enforcers sent directly from Chicago to retrieve their stolen money and permanently silence the thieves who had dared to cross their criminal syndicate. Trent pressed his back hard against the floral wallpaper of the hallway, his eyes bulging out as he stared through the glass panes of the front door. He recognized the men immediately. He knew exactly what they did to people who stole from their organization. The last remaining shred of his arrogant corporate facade evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, pathetic shell of a man. His knees buckled under his weight, and he slid slowly down the wall until he was sitting on the hardwood floor, his overcoat bunching up around his shoulders. He began to hyperventilate, taking short, desperate gasps of air, his hands pulling frantically at his hair. A dark, spreading stain began to pool near the crotch of his trousers, seeping into the fabric and dripping down onto the floorboards. He had completely lost control of his bodily functions. The businessman who had so confidently threatened to lock me in a padded room just a few days ago was now sobbing uncontrollably, wetting himself in terror. He curled his knees to his chest, burying his face in his trembling hands, fully realizing that his stolen millions could not save him from the absolute nightmare standing right on his front lawn. Natalie tore her eyes away from the terrifying scene outside and turned to look at me. The sheer panic in her chest had completely consumed her rational thought. She threw herself forward, falling hard onto her knees right in front of my heavy leather boots. She reached out with her trembling hands, her manicured fingers desperately clutching at the rough denim of my jeans. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup and leaving streaks across her pale cheeks. She tilted her head back, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes, and began to beg for her life. She cried out my name, calling me Dad, in a pathetic, desperate attempt to invoke a familial bond she had spent years actively destroying. She swore she was incredibly sorry, claiming that Trent had forced her into the entire money laundering scheme, that she never actually wanted to hurt Brad, and that she was just a terrified mother trying to survive. She begged me to raise my shotgun to stand between her and the front door and to protect her from the armed men marching up the marble steps. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. The space inside my chest, where a heart should have been beating, was completely hollowed out, replaced by a block of freezing ice. I looked at this weeping, pathetic woman, and I did not see a mother. I saw the cold-blooded monster who had systematically drugged my son, who had ordered the brakes on his truck to be cut, and who had actively participated in strapping an innocent homeless man into a vehicle to be burned alive. I remembered the silver urn sitting on the mantelpiece filled with the ashes of a stranger they had murdered, just to cover their tracks. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I simply stepped backward, physically, breaking her desperate grip on my pants, and let her fall forward onto the cold, hardwood floor. Outside the cartel, enforcers spread across the front porch, their heavy boots thudding against the wooden planks. The lead enforcer stepped right up to the mahogany door. He did not bother to knock. He raised his heavy leather boot and delivered a massive kick directly to the center of the wood. The door frame cracked loudly, splintering the expensive trim, but the heavy steel deadbolt held fast. He took a step back, raised his automatic rifle, and pointed the dark muzzle directly at the brass lock mechanism. Natalie screamed, wrapping her arms around her head and curling into a tight ball on the floor. Trent whimpered, pressing his face firmly into his knees. I tightened my grip on the pump action of my shotgun, stepping deeper into the shadows of the hallway, ready to hold my ground. The enforcer placed his finger firmly on the trigger, but before a single shot could be fired, the heavy silence of the rainy morning was violently torn apart. It started as a faint wail in the distance, rapidly growing louder with every passing second. Dozens of blaring sirens suddenly echoed through the upscale neighborhood, cutting through the dense fog like a blinding knife. Flashing red and blue lights began to violently reflect off the wet asphalt and the surrounding trees. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had arrived. Vince had calculated the timing with absolute perfection. The hunters were suddenly surrounded. The flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of the grand foyer in a chaotic, dizzying strobe effect. Through the shattered glass of the front windows, I watched the absolute destruction of the cartel's arrogant assault. Armored tactical vehicles tore through the manicured hedges, completely blocking the driveway and trapping the 3 black SUVs. Men in heavy black tactical gear swarmed the front lawn like an angry hornet's nest. The blaring sirens were deafening, but they were quickly drowned out by the amplified voice of a federal agent over a bullhorn, ordering the cartel enforcers to drop their weapons and get on the ground. The lead enforcer, the man who had just kicked the door, hesitated for a fraction of a second. That was all it took. A concussive flashbang grenade detonated on the front porch, with a blinding flash of white light and a sound that shook the foundation of the house. The thick glass of the front door completely shattered inward, raining thousands of sharp crystals onto the hardwood floor. The cartel men, hardened killers who struck fear into the hearts of everyone they met, dropped their heavy automatic rifles and fell to their knees. They laced their fingers behind their heads, realizing instantly that they were entirely outgunned and completely surrounded. The federal strike team moved with terrifying practiced efficiency, swarming the porch and pinning the enforcers to the wet concrete. It was a masterpiece of orchestrated violence, a flawless trap closing its heavy steel jaws perfectly on time. Inside the house, the atmosphere was a pathetic contrast to the militarized precision outside. As the tactical agents breached the shattered doorway, their heavy boots crunching over the broken glass, Trent and Natalie completely unraveled. Two federal agents rushed forward, their weapons drawn, shouting commands. Trent did not resist. He was still sitting in his own urine, sobbing hysterically, with his hands covering his face. An agent grabbed him roughly by the collar of his expensive overcoat, hauling him up and slamming him face first against the floral wallpaper. The metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, ratcheting around Trent's wrists, echoed through the hallway. He wept like a terrified, frightened child, begging the agents for a deal, promising to tell them everything about the money laundering operation. Natalie fared no better. An agent grabbed her by the shoulder, pulling her up from the floor. She thrashed wildly, screaming at the top of her lungs, claiming she was a victim, claiming she had been held hostage by her abusive husband and a crazy old man with a gun. The agent ignored her frantic lies, twisting her arms behind her back and locking the cuffs into place. She was shoved hard against the wall right next to Trent, her pristine white cashmere sweater, now stained with dirt and her own tears. Their luxurious kingdom of lies had instantly collapsed into dust. Through the broken doorway, I saw another satisfying piece of the trap fall into place. Officer Miller, the deeply corrupt local cop who had threatened to take my grandson away, was being marched up the driveway by two stern-looking federal agents. They had intercepted him before he could even approach the property. His tin badge had been ripped from his uniform, his service weapon confiscated, and his hands securely cuffed behind his thick back. The arrogant smirk he had worn just 24 hours ago was completely wiped from his face, replaced by the grim realization that his lucrative career of protecting criminals was permanently over. While the foyer descended into a storm of shouting agents and crying criminals, I stood perfectly still in the shadow of the dining room archway. I did not raise my hands. I did not shout. I slowly lowered the barrel of my pump-action shotgun toward the floor. With methodical, practiced calm, I pressed the action release button and pulled the heavy wooden pump backward. The unfired red shell ejected perfectly from the chamber, spinning through the air and landing on the floor with a soft thud. I repeated the motion twice more completely, unloading the magazine. I walked over to the tall wooden decorative table near the hallway, the same table I had crashed into while faking my heart attack. I gently placed the empty shotgun on the polished surface right next to the thick manila envelope containing the cartel ledgers and the audio transcripts. I turned my back on the screaming criminals, the federal agents, and the shattered remnants of my dead son's stolen life. I walked calmly down the back hallway, my heavy leather boots making a steady rhythmic sound against the hardwood floor. I opened the back door and stepped out into the freezing Seattle rain. The cold air filled my lungs, feeling cleaner and fresher than it had in days. I slowly walked down the narrow, dark side alley, moving away from the chaotic symphony of blaring sirens and shouting voices. My old Ford truck was parked exactly where I had left it. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I could see Leo sitting quietly in the passenger seat. He was wearing his winter coat, his small hands resting gently on his backpack. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face for an answer. I opened the driver's side door, climbed into the cab, and gave him a single reassuring nod. The nightmare was finally over. I put the truck in gear and slowly pulled out of the alleyway, driving past the front of the massive property. As we rolled past the line of flashing police cruisers, I caught one final glimpse of Natalie. Two federal agents were forcefully shoving her toward the back seat of a squad car. She fought against their grip, twisting her neck to look out at the street. She finally saw my old truck, She screamed my name, a piercing, desperate wail that cut through the storm, begging me to save her. I did not even bother to turn my head. 1 week passed since the morning the federal agents swarmed the driveway. The massive house had been completely seized by the government, cordoned off with bright yellow crime scene tape. I found myself walking down a sterile, brightly lit concrete hallway inside the King County Correctional Facility. The air smelled of strong bleach, stale sweat, and quiet desperation. My heavy work boots echoed against the linoleum floor as a grim-faced guard escorted me to the visitor section. I sat down on a cold, bolted metal stool and looked through the thick, smudge-covered plexiglass. A heavy steel door clanked open on the other side. A female guard led Natalie into the small, caged booth. She was wearing a shapeless, faded orange jumpsuit. The contrast between the woman sitting across from me now and the arrogant socialite from a week ago was incredibly stark. Her expensive blonde hair extensions had been removed, leaving her natural hair thin and lifeless. Without her premium cosmetics, her face looked pale, hollow, and deeply exhausted. Dark, bruised circles framed her bloodshot eyes. Her perfectly manicured fingernails were chipped, cracked, and bitten down to the quick. She sat down heavily on her metal stool and stared at me through the thick glass. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably as she looked at my face, desperately searching for a single ounce of mercy. She slowly reached out and picked up the heavy black plastic telephone receiver hanging on the wall. I picked up my receiver and pressed it against my ear. For a long moment, the only sound on the line was her ragged, uneven breathing. Then the tears started to flow. It was not the fake, calculated crying she used to manipulate me in the kitchen. It was the raw, ugly weeping of a cornered animal, realizing the trap was permanently locked. She pressed her free hand against the thick glass, leaving a greasy palm print on the clear surface. She begged me to help her. She pleaded with me to hire a good lawyer, claiming she was terrified and could not survive in this concrete box. When I remained completely silent, simply staring at her with cold indifference, she frantically shifted her tactics. She played her absolute final card. She brought up my grandson. She told me that Leo was just a young, fragile boy who desperately needed his mother. She claimed that separating a child from his mother was an unforgivable sin, and that if I truly loved him, I would find a way to get her out of this nightmare. She swore she would take Leo and move far away, that she would be a perfect parent, and that I would never have to worry about them ever again. I listened to her desperate monologue without blinking. I felt absolutely zero pity for the creature sitting on the other side of the partition. I remembered the heavy purple bruises I had seen on Leo's small wrist. I remembered her trying to burn my son alive for a paycheck. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. I unfolded it slowly, making sure she could see every deliberate movement. It was the legal document she had pushed across the kitchen island, the exact waiver designed to strip away my rights and grant her total control over the $5 million life insurance payout. I pressed the printed document flat against the thick plexiglass. I told her to read the fine print. I reminded her that she had happily forged my signature and officially submitted this document to the insurance company just days before the raid. I kept my voice low, speaking with the cold, measured tone of a judge delivering a final sentence. I explained that by legally declaring herself the sole financial guardian to steal the money, she had also signed a separate federal affidavit claiming full uncontested responsibility for the fraudulent accounts. I told her that she had literally signed away any chance of a plea deal. She had legally cemented her own guilt. Natalie stared at the document pressed against the glass, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land. The realization that her own greed was the exact mechanism keeping her behind bars finally washed over her. She dropped her head, her shoulders shaking violently. She whispered that Trent would figure something out. She claimed Trent had powerful connections and enough hidden money to post their bail. I let out a slow, quiet breath. I told her she clearly did not understand how a criminal syndicate operates. I explained that the cartel lieutenant in Chicago was not a man who allowed loose ends to sit in a federal holding cell, making deals with the government. I told her the news had just broken on the local radio that morning. Trent had been found dead in his isolated jail cell a few hours ago. I watched the last spark of hope completely extinguish from her eyes. The horrific truth settled firmly around her shoulders. She had absolutely no money, no powerful allies, no husband, and no son. She was entirely alone. Natalie dropped the heavy plastic receiver. It banged loudly against the metal wall, dangling uselessly by its armored cord. She slumped forward, pressing her forehead against the cold glass, wailing in absolute total despair. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not say goodbye. I calmly placed my receiver back onto the metal hook. I folded the legal document, tucked it safely back into my jacket pocket, and stood up from the stool. I turned my back on the glass booth and walked away, leaving her alone in the cold silence to face the consequences of her horrific actions. My heavy boots echoed loudly down the concrete corridor, carrying me back out into the bright air of the living world. I had a grandson waiting for me outside in the truck. I walked out through the heavy glass doors of the county jail and stepped into the crisp morning air. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the Seattle sky a brilliant washed-out blue. I climbed into the driver's seat of my old Ford truck. Leo was sitting right where I had left him, quietly reading a paperback book. I put the keys in the ignition, but I did not turn the engine over right away. I reached across the worn fabric seat and put my rough hand over his small shoulder. I told him that the bad people were permanently gone, locked away, where they could never hurt him again. I told him we were going on a very long trip somewhere warm, somewhere far away from the cold rain and the bad memories. Leo looked up at me, a tentative, hopeful smile breaking across his young face. I started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, and drove us straight to the airport. We were not taking the private jet that Trent and Natalie had booked. We were flying commercial using the clean, untraceable passports I had secured through Vince before we left. The flight took us south, leaving the gray Pacific Northwest far behind us. Hours melted away into the steady, rhythmic hum of the airplane engines. I kept my hand resting on the thick canvas duffel bag tucked under the seat in front of me too. It contained the $70,000 in vacuum-sealed cash that Brad had left in the airport locker. It was not cartel money. It was the honest money he had desperately scraped together, the seed for a brand new life. When we finally broke through the clouds and began our descent, the world below us was a vibrant, endless expanse of emerald green jungle and sparkling sapphire water. We had arrived in Costa Rica. We cleared customs without a single issue, two completely unremarkable tourists stepping out into the thick, humid tropical air. I rented an old, battered, open-top Jeep at the airport. It smelled of sea salt and warm canvas. We threw our bags into the back, and I steered us out of the busy city, following a winding, unpaved road that hugged the jagged coastline. The drive took 3 hours. The dense jungle canopy completely swallowed the road, filtering the bright afternoon sunlight into a soft, golden haze. Parrots flew overhead, a flash of brilliant red and blue against the green leaves. Leo stood up in the passenger seat, gripping the roll bar with his small hands, letting the warm wind rush over his face. I heard him laugh. It was a clear, ringing sound that I had not heard in months. It was the sound of the child who finally felt safe. The dirt road eventually opened up, revealing a small, remote fishing village nestled in a quiet, secluded cove. Small wooden houses painted in bright, cheerful colors dotted the pristine white sand beach. There were no luxury hotels, no car dealerships, and absolutely no cartel enforcers. Just the gentle sound of the ocean waves breaking against the shore and the smell of roasting fish in the air. I parked the Jeep near the edge of the sand and turned off the engine. I grabbed the heavy canvas duffel bag, slung it over my shoulder, and told Leo to follow me. We walked down the beach, our shoes sinking into the warm, soft sand. The salty breeze felt incredibly healing against my weathered face. About 100 yards down the shoreline, an old wooden fishing boat was pulled up onto the sand. A man was standing next to it, his back turned to us. He was wearing a loose white linen shirt and faded canvas trousers. He was bent over the heavy outboard motor, holding a greasy wrench, making adjustments to the metal casing. The familiar rhythmic clinking of steel against steel echoed across the quiet beach. My heart began to pound, a heavy, frantic rhythm in my chest. I stopped walking. I placed my heavy hand on Leo's shoulder, guiding him to a halt right beside me. I did not call out his name. I did not want to startle him. I simply stood there, letting the ocean breeze carry our scent. The man paused his work. He slowly lowered the steel wrench, wiping his grease-stained hands on a dirty rag tucked into his back pocket. He turned around to face us. He had grown a thick, dark beard, and his skin was deeply tanned by the harsh tropical sun, but the eyes were exactly the same. It was Brad. He dropped the rag onto the sand. For a fraction of a second, he just stared at us, his mouth slightly open, as if he was afraid we were a mirage that would vanish if he blinked. Then the realization washed over his face. He let out a choked, breathless sob. He stumbled forward, his bare feet kicking up the white sand, and broke into a full sprint. Leo let go of my hand and ran toward his father. They collided in the middle of the beach, falling to their knees in the warm sand. Brad wrapped his arms around his son, burying his face in the boy's neck, weeping with a joy so profound it seemed to stop the rotation of the earth. I walked up to them slowly, letting the heavy canvas duffel bag slide off my shoulder and land softly on the beach. Brad looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. He stood up, wrapped his arms tightly around my heavy shoulders, and whispered thank you into my ear. I hugged my son back, holding him tighter than I ever had in my entire life. We were free. The $70,000 in that bag would buy this boat a small house and a completely new beginning, far away from the ghosts of our past. They thought I was just a clueless old mechanic. They forgot that machines can rust, but men who forge steel in the fire never break. My name is Richard, and this is how I brought my son back from the dead. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you felt the power of a father's love and the strength it takes to fight back, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what you would have done to protect your family. Your support helps me bring more incredible stories to life. See you in the next video. The silver urn resting on the marble mantelpiece was supposed to hold the ashes of my only son. Brad was 45 years old when the police pulled his charred truck from the bottom of a deep mountain ravine just 3 days ago. Now his beautiful home was filled with the quiet murmurs of people wearing black, eating catered sandwiches, and offering me empty apologies. But my eyes were not on the guests. My eyes were fixed on the kitchen island, where my daughter-in-law Natalie stood holding a glass of expensive red wine.